Welcome to the FAV 2020 Speaker Series. Florida has quickly become a leader in the discussion about shared, electric, and automated vehicles. Florida's population of 21 million people will grow to 25 million by the end of the decade. And never has the discussion about mobility been more important. Over the last 8 years, the FAV has brought together thought leaders from around the country to provide insight into the future of mobility. Today, we're honored to have with us Adam Jonas, Managing Director of Research at Morgan Stanley. Adam's deep knowledge of the challenges and opportunities facing the global transportation marketplace make him one of the most sought-after voices in the country. Today's discussion highlights the road ahead for automakers and the shifting landscape of mobility, and we'll discuss the key drivers that will tip the global auto industry towards an electric future. And now, Adam Jonas.
Thanks, Senator Brandis. So this presentation, we're going to focus on the intersection of cars and climate change and tell the story of how EV adoption and getting off liquid fuels is going to be driven by technology companies and local and state level regulations and government actions, not so much driven by the legacy auto industry or even by national policies such as EPA policies. It's a fascinating journey, and I'm absolutely grateful to engage with you on this topic. So let's get into this. The next time you fill up your gas tank and squeeze that lever, we want you to think about what's really going on behind the scenes. When you fill your gas tank, you are contributing to carbon emissions, clearly. We travel 10 trillion miles per year globally, all cars on Earth, at an average speed of about 20 miles per gallon. So when you're squeezing that trigger, collectively, humanity, we're squeezing about 500 billion gallons into the collective gas tank of humanity. 500 billion gallons. That's 70 gallons per person on Earth. That accounts for roughly 45% of global oil demand. Now, our love affair with liquid fuels began in 1908, at this moment, when the chap on the right, Henry Ford, introduced the Model T and democratized the horseless carriage to the masses. At the same time, of course, he bankrupted the electric streetcar industry and the very nascent but fast-growing electric car industry of its day in 1908. Now, the fuel economy of the 1908 Model T from Ford was 21 miles a gallon. 111 years later, the average car on the road in the United States was about 24.7 miles per gallon. That's the average car on the fleet of the 260 million cars in the United States, according to the EPA. 24.7 miles per gallon. Over 111 years, the improvement on an annual basis has been about 0.1%. Now, of course, today's cars are much more capable and heavier and safer, and it's not totally an apples to apples comparison. But we wonder whether Henry Ford himself would be a little bit disappointed with the pace of progress. We'd be tempted to describe this pace of improvement as glacial if the glaciers weren't moving so fast. So we really need to find another naturally occurring phenomenon that's moving slower than a glacier. Now, this slide is the only chemistry slide we're going to include in this presentation, and this is just the relationship between gasoline and carbon dioxide. So you think of gasoline in your tank as a bunch of H's and C's, a bunch of hydrogen and carbon atoms, hydrocarbons, in these beautiful crystalline molecular structures. Now when you combust the hydrocarbon, the hydrogen combines with the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere to produce H2O, or water vapor. And the carbon bonds with two oxygen atoms in the atmosphere to create CO2. Now the oxygen atom is heavier than a carbon atom, and we're combining with two of those when you combust the fuel. So what this very rudimentary chemistry disclosure is supposed to say is when you combust a 1 gallon of gas, you emit about 9 kilograms of CO2. That's about 3.7 times the mass of a gallon of gasoline. 9 kilograms per gallon, okay? Just imagine you're holding like a gallon of milk in your hand. 9 kilograms that produces, times 500 500 billion gallons per year. Okay? And that's what contributes to this, which is the global energy emissions, the CO2 emissions from combusting hydrocarbons and fossil fuels every year. So we're clipping about 35 gigatons of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel. That's 35 billion tons. Of that amount, the better part of 5 billion tons, 5 gigatons, is from automobiles globally. So you might think, hey, that's only 15% of emissions. True, the majority of emissions come from buildings and industrial and coal-fired plants and things of that nature, up the energy stream. But the 5 gigatons, right, 5 billion tons, is one of the fastest growing contributors to global energy emissions on Earth, due to the rise of vehicle populations in countries like India and China, and continued rise even in the United States. Okay? So it's very, very significant, and it's growing. Now, this slide discusses what some of you who look at climate change and environmental policies might see a larger, more inclusive definition of energy emissions, which includes energy emissions from fossil fuel, but also land use and deforestation and things of that nature. That's about 53.5 gigatons of CO2. That would be the entire impact of humanity on CO2 emissions. 53.5 gigatons, folks, that's 1,700 metric tons per second. To help you think about that, that's the volumetric equivalent of 17 Empire State Buildings of mass per hour. It's the mass of about 1.2 million African elephants, the big ones, okay? The 5-ton elephants per hour, 1.2 million. Or my favorite, 2.2 billion Pomeranian puppies of mass of CO2 per hour. It's cute, it's fluffy, it's leaving the earth. Look at that thing. I don't know if anyone in the audience has a Pomeranian, but you probably want one. It's cute until you think about 19.5 trillion Pomeranians worth of mass coming at you from the tailpipe of humanity every year. Another way to think about the relationship between cars and CO2 is this image. In the United States, at least, the average car in use emits about just under 5 metric tons of CO2, 4.6 metric tons. We think that number is understated because the average mix of vehicles has gotten heavier lately. That's 3 times the mass of a Toyota Camry each year. That's the emissions, right? Now, 1 metric ton of CO2 at sea level is about volumetric equivalent of 20,000 cubic feet. That's about the volume of a 2-story home. So if you see that cube, that blue cube on the left, that's 1 ton of CO2. The average car emits about 5 of those. The average ride-sharing car, we think, emits about 25 of those. The average UPS truck, about 40 of those every year, 40 tons. I want you to remember that blue cube. Again, each car produces 5 of those a year. Remember that blue cube, and a little bit later in this presentation. Another way to think about emissions is pounds per mile. The average CO2 emissions per mile of cars in the US is about a pound a mile. Now, because it's invisible, no one cares, right? Didn't happen. But just imagine driving around your leafy suburb, rolling down the window, throwing out a pound of trash every mile, times 10,000 miles a year for your car. That's what's happening in the United States, okay? Now, at Morgan Stanley, I'd say that we're one of the most aggressive EV adopting forecasts that we have. Very aggressive. We think that EV sales are going to account for over 30% of global light vehicle sales by the year 2030, up from around 2% today. But to make a dent into CO2 emissions, you can't just affect the cars on sale at any one time. You have to affect the cars on the road. And so even an aggressive assumption, a Morgan Stanley aggressive assumption, 1/3 of cars EVs in 10 years, that's aggressive. We're struggling to think of how physically we can even refine that much lithium and cobalt and nickel to kind of supply that and to have the infrastructure to charge that. But even with that, we get to about 20% of miles traveled electric by the year 2035. We don't get to 40 or 50% of miles traveled electric until the years in the early 2040s. So even in aggressive EV adoption, we think we're going to emit probably 100 gigatons or more of CO2 from the internal combustion fleet. This excludes the CO2 from the electric cars. We can take that later in the presentation or in the Q&A. Now that's just for driving the cars. But what about making the cars? Okay, the CO2 for making a car, according to some studies, is as high as 17 tons per car. That's more than 3 years worth of CO2 just to make the car before it's even driven with 0 miles on the odometer. Now you might not think that's a big deal until I tell you that we make 3 cars every second. Okay, 3 cars every second. Folks, there are 4 babies born every second. We make almost as many cars every second as babies are born. Please don't ask me how much CO2 it takes to make a baby. I'm not going into that. All right, I'll take that back. Let's move on. Tech and cars. What does the technology industry have to do with the evolution of cars from internal combustion to sustainable electric car propulsion? Let's talk about it. First, if you're on the board of a $2 or $3 trillion tech company like Apple, you can't afford to exclude addressable markets. You need to constantly find ways to grow your market cap, to grow your earnings. And so the auto industry happens to be a very huge market. Look at this chart. The top set of ovals would be how a traditional auto analyst or how Henry Ford would describe the size of the market. Units times price. 80 million cars sold a year this year, times around 19,000 bucks per car globally. $1.5 trillion. That's 2% of GDP globally. But the Silicon Valley definition is very different. We're talking 10 trillion miles traveled. That's a known, that's all vehicles on Earth, times a roughly $1 per mile, which includes depreciation, insurance, finance charge, fuel, maintenance, tires, parking, right? Not just to purchase the car, but to own and to operate the car. That's $10 trillion of GDP. That's 13% of global GDP. If you're a tech firm, you can't afford to let someone else get that addressable market. You want to go into that. Another reason why the tech industry is so interested in autos is the amount of time that we spend in cars. Again, 10 trillion miles. That number, just for, simple math, 1 billion cars times 10,000 miles a car. It's actually more like 1.2 billion cars now and a little less than 10,000 miles a car. But you get the picture. 10 trillion miles, the average speed about 25 miles per hour. Okay? That's 400 billion vehicle hours. We also know the occupancy rate, about 1.55. So humanity spends over 600 billion hours inside cars every year. 600 billion hours. It's a mind-boggling number. 600, just say it, 600 billion hours. That's 68 million years, folks, okay? 68 million years ago was the late Cretaceous period at the end of the Mesozoic era, the height of the dinosaurs. The Earth looked like this. Bees were pollinating the first flowering plants at the end of the Mesozoic era. And the amount of time that humanity is spending in cars is actually growing. Okay, it's growing. Now, there's a variety of technology companies that have demonstrated their interest in the auto industry because of its size, because of the amount of time we spend, and also because they think they can bring something to the table in terms of autonomy, AI, neural networks, machine learning, Internet of Cars. Internet of Cars, or IoC, is the mother of Internet of Things, and autonomous cars have been described by Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, as the mother of all AI. Okay? If we can get cars to really drive themselves, you're exercising something that approaches general AI. And those applications span a vast, vast amount of markets, from transportation to national security and everything else in between, right? And so these are the logos of the companies that currently have autonomous vehicle licenses in the state of California. It's pretty much a who's who of tech. A couple years ago, there was one logo added every 2 weeks. That hype has died down a bit, but you're still getting many, many billions of dollars and then tens of billions moving in to this market. Now, this chart probably needs to be up to date because the market caps of these companies keep going up all the time. But when we're asked who has the financial wherewithal to really disrupt the auto industry, when we ask that question, we often hear our clients say Toyota or a legacy OEM. And we're thinking, yeah, they're definitely a part of it. But what about the $1 trillion club? What about the TerraCaps, right? Who has access to capital and talent in this arms race, really, right? This is where these companies, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, come into play. And there's more. There's just giving you a smattering. These companies individually are worth substantially more than all automotive companies combined. All of them. So again, the movement from internal combustion to electric, it's an arms race. It's going to require tens and tens, ultimately tens of trillions of capital, depending how far out you go. Many, many hundreds of billions of CapEx and R&D. Hundreds and hundreds of billions of COGS, cost of goods sold, and supply chain and infrastructure. To put all that responsibility on the existing car makers, that'd be like asking the kerosene and whale oil network of the late 19th century to roll out the electric utility grid. I might be a little disrespectful with that comment, but just think about it. Who's in position to attract talent and capital? We think that issue is really, really underappreciated by the investment community and other observers on this story. Now, this, I think, is the most important slide in the deck. This is Amazon's shipping costs in billions of dollars. Let's make a couple observations here first. First one is, it's big. They spend probably $50 billion on shipping in 2020 alone. That number might be underestimated because of all that's going on with Amazon as an essential service. $50 billion. Now, that's just outbound shipping from the warehouse to your door. That does not include the shipping from the supplier to the Amazon warehouse. That's borne by the supplier. Second observation is it's growing really fast, even faster than Amazon's revenues. It's increasing as a percentage of the revenues through the next decade. Now, we don't know the exact miles traveled of the Amazon fleet, but we do have a very good idea of the modality: planes, trains, and automobiles. Our team in tech and our team in transport have done an enormous amount of work on Amazon's captive and third-party logistics network, and we have a pretty good idea of the CO2 emissions by order of magnitude. So while we don't know the exact CO2 emissions, we know how much they spend and we can back into it, and it's significant. Even by Jeff Bezos' own admission, Amazon's impact, even though it's an internet company, their impact on the physical world is enormous, and they have a responsibility, and they're under increasing scrutiny to do something about it. Okay? I also have to mention that this excludes the CO2 emissions in the expenditure for their automated warehouses and data centers. That's another $50 billion. And yes, that produces CO2 as well. So you have a situation here where I don't know at what point this year, but it's very possible over the next 2 or 3 years, Amazon could be one of the largest, if not the single largest entity producing CO2 emissions. Bigger maybe than anything but the China coal complex. And this is why Amazon is taking matters into their own hands, weaponizing green, trying to go to zero emission final mile logistics faster than their competitors. They want to be in a position where they can tell the mayor of Tallahassee, look, we have zero emission vehicles. Our competitors are still using the big brown trucks. Weaponize green, make a green moat, and be the only game in town. You're going to see some tech companies doing things like this, and guess what? They can afford to do it. They can afford to do it, and they might be held to a different standard. And this is happening in our cities, right? The epicenter of economic activity. Cities account for 2% of the world's land area, but 70% of the world's emissions. Just imagine you're in the International Space Station looking down at the Earth at night. Where are the lights? It's concentrated in the coasts, concentrated in our big cities. And what that means is the cities have, not only do they represent a disproportionate amount of CO2 emissions, but they have the disproportionate regulatory authority to do something about it, right? They don't have to totally wait for Congress to agree on a green infrastructure bill, for example. That'll come one day. I'm not holding my breath for next year, but in the meantime, you get mayors all over the world working with the city councils and the local utility boards and commissions to do something about it. And their citizens want it. Now, while I've seen scientific debate, and you have as well, debate as to whether CO2 materially contributes to climate change, we have not seen any scientists that we've talked to debate whether these chemicals, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, NOx, whether those are good for our children. There's no debate. You do not want to breathe this stuff in. Not good. And unlike CO2, which gets up into the jet stream and becomes a global problem, these chemicals kind of create a dome over your city, like a smog-like dome. And that's kicking a lot of cities, London, Paris. I mean, I just mentioned just a few of them here. There's thousands of cities that are getting quite aggressive. And as you've seen, fairly recently, you get whole countries like Germany and the United Kingdom talking about outlawing the sale of internal combustion vehicles in the next 10 or 15 years. Governor Newsom in California, some pretty aggressive stuff. Let's see them follow through on it. But the fact that they're even entertaining that is a big narrative change just from a year or two ago. So we did a case study within the city to understand city emissions, because as an auto analyst, I cover a sector where I can identify carbon emissions at a corporate level, at a vehicle level, and at a geographic level. Let's take a look at Los Angeles just as an example. Now, before Uber, LA had about 7 million cars. This data comes from the Department of Motor Vehicles in California. After Uber, over 8 million cars. So my first observation is it doesn't look like ride sharing is really reducing vehicle ownership that much yet. Might even be creating the opposite effect. It's taking people out of taxis and public transport, putting them on the road. So we got 8 million cars in Los Angeles, right? We know the miles per car. We have a pretty good idea of the miles traveled in LA, about 107 billion miles per year, just in LA. That's the equivalent distance of the Earth to the Sun 1,149 times, just in Los Angeles. We know the fuel economy. We're combusting about 4 billion gallons of gasoline per year, just in LA, and emitting about 1.2 metric tons of CO2 per second, just in LA. Okay, so imagine a pie chart. Who contributes to that 1.2 metric tons per second? How much of it is Amazon? How much is Uber? How much is Lyft? How much is the post office? How much is, right? You could do this kind of work and then start to go to companies or institutions, at institutional level, and say, what's your plan, right? Because what you want to avoid is creating a circumstance where you demonize a poor family or a low-income family that's driving a 13-year-old car out of necessity and saying, hey, I hope you get rich quick and buy an EV. That's going to be something that the policymakers are going to have to try to avoid doing, right? But you can get the thin end of the wedge to go after wealthy and well-capitalized companies that have the data to transition the fleets and can own or help operate their infrastructure, right? And get that utilization of the charging asset, the charging infrastructure, instead of just waiting for people to get rich and all buy Teslas. Does that make sense? So an example in New York City, again, of all emissions, vehicle emissions account for about 15.5 million metric tons of emissions, about a third of all emissions in New York City. Remember that blue cube I showed you earlier, that blue cube of one metric ton at one atmosphere of pressure or at sea level? Imagine that each of these little blue spheres is 1 metric ton. This is the amount of CO2 emissions from New York City emitted in one day. And this is 1 year. All right, let's talk about ride sharing, but before I begin, wow, what a crazy picture. I mean, I really hope that this is an autonomous car. I mean, isn't that ridiculous? All right, let's get into this. Look, ride sharing is great, makes life kind of convenient. It gives people jobs. There's a lot of benefits, don't get me wrong. I know a lot of institutional investors that operate sustainability funds that own ride sharing on the premise that it will reduce wasteful miles and reduce cars and help, the word sharing, right? We all want our kids to share. I'm not sure if mine do, but, we tell them to. If you have a ride sharing fleet of 1.5 million vehicles, and let's face it, over 99% of the fleet of those ride sharing fleets are internal combustion cars, they're going to emit about 2,000 or more metric tons of CO2 per hour. Okay? I mean, you can check for yourself. Check the transcripts of some of the ride-sharing firm conference calls, the quarterly conference calls, and do a control F on the transcript for the word carbon or climate. It doesn't really come up yet. It's going to come up. Big footprint, and they can really do something about it. And we are going to see them doing something about it. And they're actually hiring EV infrastructure people to do it because they don't want to they want to do it on their terms preferably, and they certainly don't want to be in a position where they say, no, we're going to stay carbon heavy, because that's horrible PR. Let's face it. It's also bad business long term. This slide shows the number of vehicles in the city of San Francisco, the yellow line being the number of taxis over a 24-hour day. And then the dark line is the combination of the Ubers and the Lyfts, the ride-sharing firms. So if you take an average of that, there's about 15 times the number of ride-sharing cars in San Francisco than taxis. So again, it's incredible how much these things have grown. Let's talk about some public policy considerations. This is an interesting quote from the CEO of Volkswagen a little over a year and a half ago, I guess, where he said, and I quote, "Volkswagen's passenger cars are responsible for 1% of global CO2 emissions." And then he said he hopes to get that to 0. 1%. Now that's for the youth. So look, they're the arms dealers. They're not the ones firing the arms. They're just the arms dealers. But that's the CO2 emitted from their cars. So you can think about cars account for about 10% of emissions, and Volkswagen's 1/10 of the 10, right? To make it kind of simple. Now, if you include the manufacturing of those cars and the trucks, because these guys also make heavy trucks, they're closer to 2%. 2% of global emissions. Now, listen, when you add up carbon footprints, you're going to get to over 100, because you could say, here's what it produced, here's who drove, and here's my footprint, your footprint. You're going to add up to over 100. But my point is, you're getting people in positions of responsibility of carbon emitting companies that are on record kind of owning up and just being realistic about it, saying, look, that's our business. We were built on internal combustion, but to survive, we need to do something else. The next couple of charts just show you some interesting examples of how there's pricing of carbon right now in key markets. I'll make this chart simple, except to say that in Europe right now, and the European Commission will essentially assess a fine for any vehicle manufacturer that produces a car that emits more than 95 grams of CO2 per kilometer. Okay, sorry, we're using the metric system here. 95 grams of CO2 per kilometer. And what that basically equates to over the lifetime of the car, because if you take that 1 gram of, let's say you came in at 96, and you multiplied that times the 15,000 kilometers that a car drives per year in Europe, and then multiplied that times 15 years of useful life, that extra gram is going to accumulate to about 225 kilograms of CO2. And the penalty for that is 95 euros. 95 euros, about over $100 for that. That equates to about almost $500 per metric ton. Now, anyone in the audience here, or if you ask anyone that looks at carbon tax, anything above like 10 or 15 bucks is like big. You talk to the real environmentalists and they dream about 50 bucks, 100 bucks. We're talking over 422 euros or $500 of carbon tax right now being applied in Europe. Big market. And then in London, I thought this example was interesting. If you take an Uber in London, they charge a 15 pence per mile. We moved it to 20 cents per mile surcharge. They call it a clean air charge that goes into a fund to help drivers buy electric cars. We know the fuel economy of the average car in these fleets, a good idea of it. We solve for about $1,000 a ton. Pretty amazing, right? $1,000 a ton. Now that would bankrupt the world if you had to use $1,000 a ton on all carbon emissions. But for the people fortunate enough to be sitting in traffic going from the east end to the west end of London, that extra carbon tax only accounts for about 4% of the Uber price. It's so small that when I've asked my clients in London, have you noticed the clean air fee, they said no. They pull out their app and like, oh, there it is. Yeah, I didn't notice. It was only 4 or 5%. But yet it was $1,000 a ton. So you're going to see cities all over the world start to institute these things. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that getting off liquid fuels, internal combustion is going to be easy, cheap, or not controversial. It's going to be a mess, right? We got to create all new infrastructure that doesn't exist in some cases. We have to have policies at local and national level. We got to have carrot and stick. There's red tape. There are going to be jobs lost and created. There's going to be tens of trillions of capital reallocated across different sectors, right? There are major labor implications. To make an electric car versus an internal combustion car can take less than half the number of people. You're dramatically simplifying the car. You're going from like a Patek Philippe Swiss watch to Casio G-Shock, right? You're dramatically simplifying it. The CEO of Daimler the other day was saying they're going to be a smaller company. That's German for we might have to restructure, which means job cuts and restructuring charges. So it's going to be painful, right? It's not all just about growth, but it's going to happen. It's not going to happen linearly, right? And I'd say that charging infrastructure is a massive, massive bottleneck. And then the income inequality issues involved in kind of obviating internal combustion tech without destroying the auto credit environment or the used car environment is another one. There's, of course, a long tail of issues to take into consideration. And then on the environmental side, as we solve certain ESG or environmental issues, we're going to create new ones. You think making an EV is beautiful for the world and environment? No. You got to get rare earths. You got to spray acid on the side of a mountainside to get some of these chemicals. There's huge energy that takes to make an EV. In fact, making EVs right now, it takes more energy up front than making an internal combustion car. If you're charging with a coal-fired plant, you really didn't reduce your emissions that much. So there's a lot of puts and takes that we have to deal with here. So we're going to create new ESG and environmental problems in some ways as fast as we're solving them, and it's got to be a net versus gross, right? We worked across our teams at Morgan Stanley to understand how much this costs, and that's this slide, which is it's a kind of combination of cost of goods sold for batteries and powertrain, EV infrastructure, and then CapEx and R&D, and we come up with some big numbers, folks. Over $20 trillion. Now that's an aggregate expenditure to move the world's cars to electric over the next 30 years. So on an average, it's about 70 basis points of global GDP per year, okay? Or about 700 billion divided by 100 trillion of global GDP. Big number, but 70 basis points, okay, still big, but we can understand 0.7% of GDP allocated to it, which given the scope of the task makes sense. And look, if we don't spend the money on internal combustion, then we're going to have to spend the money on something else, more exotic fuels, more exotic, if we don't spend the money on EVs, we're going to spend the money making these super, super complex devices, basically. Does that make sense? And we think it's a pretty modest price to pay when you think about the environmental, economic, and geopolitical risks. And so again, some of the messages we want to leave you with: cars and climate are inextricably linked through CO2 emissions. We think that tech firms are going to drive the evolution much, much faster than auto. Auto will be a part of it, but tech will be more. Cities are going to be involved to fund the infrastructure. There's going to be a lot of policies in effect. This kind of combination of tech, climate change, and the kind of urgency at a local level to deal with fleets and logistics fleets, et cetera. It's going to accelerate the EV development, and big, big money. This is an arms race, right? So this last slide just shows an example of how at Morgan Stanley we try to connect the dots across sectors, because electric cars isn't so much a sector, it's a theme. And in order to understand a theme, you got to work across the sector stack with our colleagues in semiconductors, metals and mining, energy, machinery, cap goods, tech hardware, chemicals, batteries, everything. I mean, this industry touches everything, right? And so while I know a lot of the subject matter that Senator Brandes and the team at FAV focused on is around autonomous vehicles, and that's still progressing. We think that the faster delta over the next few years is going to be electric. And I think the two are related, because as we move more rapidly to internal combustion, it's going to attract tech firms that have a natural tendency to apply software, AI, machine learning, and we think that the acceleration of the state of the art of electric will accelerate autonomous, and those two have a symbiotic relationship. But I'll finish this presentation by saying that climate change it's almost like Mother Nature's scrappage scheme, and it's Mother Nature's stimulus for an industry that maybe over the last 100 years got a little too cozy, a little too comfortable, a little boring. Maybe it coasted for a while. Maybe we've all coasted for a while, right? And so, we have to innovate to solve the problem, whether it's, we can debate the science, and maybe some people are going to come out saying climate change only warms the earth this much, and others say it warms it this much. Some say we don't need to do anything about it. We can't help it. Some say it's too late. Some say, no, we need to do it now. But, I think about the state of Florida, and you guys are in the red zone, right? I mean, Senator Brandes, you have to tell me what's the average elevation of the state of Florida? What's the average elevation of South Florida? I mean, so you guys, just appreciate our place in history right now and having to deal with us. And the next time, and I hope I'm wrong, but statistically, the next time there's a major storm or environmental catastrophe or a couple meters of water in a place that normally shouldn't have that much water in your state or in other states, whether people believe in climate change or not, whether people believe the science or not, they're just going to choose to believe that we humans can do something about it, right? We're just going to choose to believe we have control over it. Whether it's rational or not, we're going to have to try something, right? And so this theme's not going away. I wish storms would stop. I wish all that hardship could stop, but look at the data, right? So this theme is going to be with us, and I actually think there's a silver lining, because you put people working together, smartest people in the industry, working with government, smartest people in government, you get taxpayer motivation behind it and public awareness, there's nothing we can't solve. We're going to solve this. We're going to fix it. We're going to adapt to it. And along the way, there's going to be enormous economic development across the country, certainly in Florida. And I wish you all well and good luck in that endeavor. Happy to engage with you guys at this point, and I'd be delighted to take any questions that you might have. Thanks very much for having me, Senator Brandes.
Right now, as cities prepare for the future of mobility, we are here. We're reimagining everything from the ground up and harnessing the power of collaboration, working with you to create the infrastructure solutions that turn your challenges into successful community icons. By rethinking the future of transportation, we are here to create the community that's important to you, to all of us.
And we're live. Thanks so much, Adam. That was an incredible presentation, and really kind of look forward to the discussion. If you've got questions, if you'd like to ask Adam, I'm happy to pass them along, and we'll have a discussion about kind of the future of electrification and where this is all going. So it's exciting to kind of see this play out. So kind of walk me through what you think the next 10 years look like, Adam. Just how does that play out?
Next 10 years. Wow, I wish I had a crystal ball. And I don't want to give the impression that I have all the answers, right? I presented a view of the future one of many views of the future. But what I think we're going to have here is clearly everything that we see right now in this industry. 98% of cars sold right now are internal combustion. And so part of my message to your audience is really don't overthink it, right? Take the over on 2%. I engage with suppliers and boards and C-suites of auto companies all over the world, regulatory bodies and others like yourself, Senator. And we can debate the telemetry of it. But 10 years from now, we think we're going to be roughly 1/3 EV penetration globally, around a third EV penetration in the United States, and we're going to be seeing new businesses being created, entire new auto companies that don't exist today, and then the existing auto industry they're going to have to decide what to write down, what to invest in. And it's not going to be an easy story. So we're going to have wealth creation and wealth destruction at the same time. And I think that policies at the state and local level and decisions made by boards and large companies will make the difference between whether the United States can remain a leader in this great industry and in these new industries, or whether we're taking a lead from some of our economic rivals. And so the time is now. The decisions made over the next 2 or 3 years are going to have an impact over the next 2 decades. Autonomy over the next 10 years, though, Senator, it's going to happen. It's going to move. We know the end state, like autonomy works. But we think that's going to be a lot slower. It'll trickle into logistics fleets. It'll trickle into non-human transportation, geo-fenced areas, things like that. To get to that vertical point where you have widespread adoption of cars without steering wheels, Senator, I think it's not so much technology that's the limiter. It's going to be the moral, legal, regulatory, and social acceptance, the kind of, icky stuff that you really can't model that will determine that. But again, we think beyond 2030 we get the steep part, but that's going to come as well.
And how are people talking about the gas tax? One of the questions we have is, about, obviously the replacement of the gas tax. What are you seeing states and countries kind of doing to model that out?
Gas tax is interesting. And by the way, can you hear me if I have this out while I'm talking? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Great, because there's a bit of a loop going on in the background. Sorry about that. Gas tax. Gas tax hadn't changed since I believe 1992, 1993, right, at the federal level. There's obviously been changes at the state levels. So you have this situation where if so much of the sales of gasoline contribute to maintaining our roads and bridges and tunnels, right? And we're going to have this de-adoption of gasoline. We need to rethink fiscal policies to create and support and build new infrastructure. So you might see a combination of things. I don't think you're going to see gas tax going up to compensate for lower gas purchases, because then you're just going to be hammering on the lower and middle class, right, Senator? I just don't think that's going to really work as a sustainable. There's all sorts of wealth inequality issues there. I think that ship has kind of sailed, right? You might see some. But I think we're going to have to rethink how we charge at the electric grid, right? I mean, you move all the 250 million cars in the United States to the grid, we're going to be putting a ton of strain on the step-down transformers and substations and generation and, who's going to pay for all that? So maybe we have to rethink usage fees or fees on the terawatt hours that are being produced by the grid or being consumed. You might have taxes that go into are conceived on a congestion charging basis, right? There are cities in Europe that have done it, the US not so much, but we're starting to see it. New York City starts to open up congestion charging zones in 2021. We think there'll be cities like in Los Angeles and others that do it on the grounds of keeping their cities vibrant and more pedestrianized, but also trying to raise money, right? Trying to raise money because you got to pay for this stuff. I think you'll go after heavy users. You may not go after mom and pops that own a 14-year-old car just struggling to get by, but maybe you go after the Ubers and Lyfts and the Amazons that are producing record profits and getting increasing share and are in a position to kind of pay for these things. Then that leaves the federal government. And I think as we exit COVID, right, another zeitgeist kind of let's recognize where we are in history. We got a lot of unemployed people out here, right? Maybe structurally unemployed. after some certain industries might not get back to where they were before, and might take a while to get back to where they were before. And we got to put these people to work. And, there's all sorts of talk in Congress about infrastructure bill. And as you know, it takes 20, 30 years sometimes for these infrastructure projects to really pan out. And so if we want to skate to where the puck is going over a 10, 20, 30-year horizon, you're going to steer that infrastructure spend towards electric and autonomous. You're not going to be investing in the Henry Ford, version of propulsion. So that's going to be a lot of give and take. Certainly we're not going to have all that resolved in the next Congress, right? It's going to take a succession of Congresses to kind of see that through. Some things might need to get worse to kind of get that. I hope we don't have an infrastructure catastrophe with a loss of life that gets people on side. But, think of infrastructure as the cardiovascular system of the economy, the transportation economy. And I think that when you think about infrastructure, not just in bridges and tunnels or roads or rail or trucks, but if you add to that telecom, spectrum, satellites, electric grid, right? Cybersecurity, and you think of it as like a nestled ecosystem, those are the kinds of things that the U.S. taxpayer is going to get involved in. So I'm not trying to kind of leave you with a message, raise taxes on everybody. It's just that you could interpret that way. It's we're at our best as a country when we can double down and use the power of the taxpayer base to actually make bets that we can get a good return on. And I think you might agree we can get a good return on investing in future vehicle technology.
So Ben Walker has a question: is what do the impacts look like if the U.S. isn't the leader in the adoption, and we have to follow other countries?
I mean, you're talking about taking some of the social and geopolitical and economic problems that have been bubbling to the surface lately today and taking it to a new level. So we start having an issue of, if we don't do that, we start to put our future at risk. We put ourselves where we can't control our own destiny, where we don't try difficult things that get our children to apply their skills towards things other than social media influencing, sports management, and video gaming. I have 3 kids. I know you got 4 kids. So what we have an opportunity to do here is not just to solve emergent, and existing national security problems. I mean, maybe Florida's different. I'm not speaking specifically for Florida, but at a national level, the state of U.S. infrastructure is, some call it embarrassing, some call it out of date. I call it dangerous. Not just dangerous to lives, but dangerous to our future as well. And so I think if we want to continue to be, a leader, we have to invest in these difficult things as innovation catalysts. In the 1960s, Senator, they called this the Apollo effect, right? When JFK wanted to put a man on the moon back, that did more for our math and sciences and our test scores boomed, right? And we were competing with the Soviets at that point. Well, we got new competition now. I'm not necessarily going to call them out in this webcast. I think you know who they are, but we got new rivals. And they're prioritizing math and science and quantum and AI and cyber and space. And we have to too. And you know what? I feel pretty good about our chances when we have competition. I invite the competition. So it's not just keeping our country moving in the right direction, but also thinking about our country's place in the world. And now's the time to capture that. So, you're in a really, really unique position, Senator, in your state and in events like this to help increase awareness and really affect how capital is deployed. And that's among your list of accomplishments is going to go down in one of your ways you're changing the world.
Let's talk a little bit about charging infrastructure. I mean, obviously, you've got some companies that are in the private side. Governments are getting a little bit engaged in the charging infrastructure. Where do you see that playing out? Where's the leadership there as it relates to overall charging infrastructure, if this is the future we're headed towards? So
charging infrastructure is like a hot mess right now. It's kind of disorganized. There's different standards. You got companies like Tesla that have 2,000 supercharging points and then 19,000 individual, connectors, and they're growing that at 30% a year. You got companies like ChargePoint and other third parties that are trying to set standards and doing it, OEM agnostic. You have other OEMs that are doing it. You have electric utility companies that are getting in. the challenge right now, think of the charging infrastructure as if you had asked me in the 1880s or 1890s, what are the standards for electricity generation and distribution? There were those standards between AC and DC and what kind of technologies were used, what kind of materials were used. Those weren't set in stone either yet, right? So it's still forming. I think they all have a role, but I would say this: I like to use the example of the U.S. National Highway Defense Act back in the 1950s, when our men and women were coming back from World War II, and they were coming back from Korea in the early 50s, and they were sitting around, and we were like, all right, we're going to do the Highway Act. And we built 40,000 miles of highway in the United States. And did we have GM and Ford and Chrysler pay for it? No, they weren't in a position to pay for it themselves. That was another area where it was a combination of usage taxes on gasoline and federal efforts and state efforts all working together. Public, private, fiscal and private and economic all working together to build it out. I do think Elon Musk is a force to be reckoned with. He has, there's 140,000 gas stations, 2,000 charging. He'll have 5,000 or 10,000 charging stations in the United States alone. And that's just high voltage superchargers. That excludes his destination chargers, right? But part of the geometry of charging isn't just GPS points where you throw down a megawatt here or a megawatt there. It will also come down to battery technology. Because right now we're thinking of charging, we're trying to conceive charging infrastructure with technologies that might take an hour or 2 hours to charge at a certain voltage, right? What if there was a breakthrough in chemistry or in software and chemistry and form factor that could allow you to charge a car fully in 3 minutes? I mean, it works in a lab, it doesn't work commercialized yet, but what if? What if you could charge as fast as you fill a tank or less? Maybe you don't need as many charging stations at that point. Maybe they don't need to be in certain areas, right? If homes were upgraded and equipped with these fast charging with units that even at 240 volts that could charge a car in 10 minutes, that changes the whole architecture. So all these things are kind of moving along. So there may be a risk, Senator, of conceiving the infrastructure and setting it in stone too early when so much is still evolving and the battery is still not mature. So I think for better or worse, you're going to see this multiple campaign of technology and policies experiments going on in the background bit by bit by bit over the next 3 to 5 years. Maybe 5-10 years from now, we'll have a better sense for how the technology's evolved, and then we can go move the big fiscal guns in. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about workforce. Obviously, when you're moving from internal combustion engine vehicles that have thousands of moving parts to an electric vehicle that has radically less moving parts, you're going to impact the workforce on the service side. I think I read a statistic that essentially for car dealerships, about half of their profit comes in via service and not actually car sales. Yeah. And so we would see that being disrupted. Gas stations, but there's probably oil change locations. All of those things begin to shift. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the implications of the ripples of electric vehicles and shifting the fleet to electric vehicles?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's a story of innovation, right? When we went from hunting and gathering to agriculture, those bow and arrow sales probably collapsed after the last ice age. When we went there were all sorts of stories written at the dawn of the horseless carriage about what's going to happen to all this, the wheelwright industry or the horse industry. It's going to be devastating. What about the whale oil and kerosene companies, distribution companies that are all going to go bankrupt when Edison and Westinghouse have their way? So here we are again, right? You can't stop it. You got to evolve. We're an adaptable species. This transition might happen a little faster, but it's not going to happen overnight. So this transition is going to take 1 or 2 decades, not 1 or 2 years. It will be disruptive. There will be jobs lost. There will be jobs created. So yes, we'll have fewer oil change jobs, more software jobs. We're going to have fewer mechanical engineering jobs, more electric engineering jobs. And how the net and the gross of that is in 1 year, in some years it could be bad for the economy. In some years it could be wonderful for the economy, right? But if you think about the end state, cleaner, safer, self-reliant, sustainable transportation, more efficient, we're going to have millions of jobs that are maintaining these mega fleets of autonomous and electric logistics fleets, right? We are. And then we didn't get into urban air mobility yet, but like think of all the jobs. If you really solve electric and get battery performance and charging and energy density down to levels that we can't imagine right now, or an order of magnitude better, then you're introducing entire new industries that don't exist, like moving around, like public transportation in the state of Florida using eVTOLs. You're going to have people working at these helipads and eVTOL pads and servicing these things and the rotors and the blades. And so as long as we're going to move our physical goods and services around the earth and move our bodies around the earth, we're going to have a lot of jobs. They're just going to be redistributed. And we might have different companies that are employing these people, right? Might have different companies employing. But my guess is that we're creating, in the end state, we're creating much more than we're destroying.
So let's talk a little bit about just the battery technology itself. Obviously, there's some rare earth components of it. There's obviously an evolving technology as it relates to batteries. Where do you see that going as far as just capacity, density, all of those types of the technology improvements in batteries over the next few years?
Yeah, I'll just say 3 words, and watch Elon Musk. I'm sorry if I'm coming. I sometimes can come across as a fanboy, but and the dude, everyone's got their hubris too, right? I'm not saying that I'm not talking about perfection, but boy, he is in a position to hire the Nobel Prize winning chemists. He is. And to put them in an environment where they're encouraged to blow stuff up and take risk. And a lot of the established auto industry is like, no, don't do that. Like, don't do that, we'll get sued. Or don't do that, it'll hurt our golden goose, right? God forbid you hurt the F-150 sales by making a great electric truck, right? Some conflict in there. But on the battery side, everything's changing. And I'll just use his example. What he's doing is he's taking what used to be historically has been a 7% cost down of cost per kilowatt hour, getting us down to just over $100 a kilowatt hour now, $120, $130. And he's tripling that over the next 5 years. He wants to kind of do about a 20% CAGR, cost down of cost per kilowatt hour. He also wants to reduce the cost of building the plant. What used to cost maybe $3 or $4 billion to make 100 gigawatts of battery capacity. He wants to do that for about 70% less. He's doing that by, without getting too far down the rabbit hole, things like dry cell battery technology. So instead of current battery technology involves this liquid slurry that you put over these multiple kilometers of these rolls and furnaces and you bake out the solvent. It's horrible for the environment and you can't stack them on top of each other because it's all thermal. And he's saying, I don't need any of that stuff. So I can use the entire every cubic meter of a box and turn it into a giant machine making batteries. And so everything from the manufacturing process, the chemistry, the form factor, the density, the materials, he's vertically integrating that. He wants to go nuts for the next 5 years, and then he's going to open up his patents and let everybody else make it and then innovate from there. Because he knows that he can't. Batteries are such a national security issue. It's not realistic to have one U.S. company having half the Countries don't want to be reliant on one country or one party for that. So it's all up for grabs. There's even things like solid state, which could alone, they promise over twice or maybe even 4 times the energy density. If you talk to 10 battery experts, Senator, you're going to get 10 radically different things that all work in a lab right now. They're really, really, really hard to do, mass produced. But again, back to my 3 words, watch Elon Musk for the next 2 years. And we're going to get proof points even throughout 2021 as he ramps up his Fremont factory from around 1 gigawatt hour to 10 and then from 10 to 100. And I think the amount of capital just on batteries alone that will be deployed over the next decade could be, I'm giving you order of magnitude, a couple $1 trillion. Isn't that nuts? Now that includes everything up the chain from refining and mining, getting these minerals out of the earth, and then there's the recycling industry as well. That doesn't even exist right now yet. That's a giant business in and of itself that will be employing many, many hundreds of thousands of people. It doesn't exist yet.
Yeah. So we've got a question here about EV affordability and how we see EVs being made affordable in communities of color and low income from an ownership perspective.
So look, I mean, the costs are Elon's whole ethos is to just try to get the cost down as fast as possible, right? So EV, from an acquisition standpoint, electric vehicles should cross over to the average internal combustion affordability by mid-decade. If you count things like your lower maintenance costs and lower fuel costs and things like that, and you ignore some inconveniences like where do I charge, which are real inconveniences right now, I don't want to overlook that. We might get to parity even sooner. But he doesn't want to stop there. I mean, EVs theoretically should be. I mean, here's an example I'll use. I mean, if I went back in time, if I went back to like the Swiss watchmaking industry of like the late 19th century, and I brought them a Casio G-Shock watch, and I said, "Here's the watch of the future," they'd say, "We can't make. That's magic. We can't do that. That would cost all the money in the world to make that." Right? And now it's like, no, now the Patek Philippe is what costs, $100,000. It's all flipped. So I think when you can really mass produce these skateboards, essentially, and we're going to be 3D print, we're going to be like printing these cars in mass. When Foxconn, who makes your phone, gets into making cars, and yeah, we think Foxconn will be one of the world's largest, if not the largest EV maker. There's no reason why these cars can't get down to just the hardware down to 10 grand or less. I mean, Akio Toyoda, the CEO of Toyota, describes EVs as toys. He says they're toys. And what he means by that is they're really easy to make. So, I think we'll look back at, oh my goodness, that complexity of the internal combustion car, all that. It was like a Da Vincian monstrosity. That was the expensive. That was the thing that was not affordable. But maybe the point you're getting at is that transition. What if, because 9 out of 10 new car purchases involve a trade-in? And so if you have a poor family or lower middle income family has an internal combustion car and an auto loan, and they're upside down on that loan, how can they afford to buy the new car? So that's, again, getting back down to policies. What policies could be in place so that we're not oppressive to the many, many millions of households that just don't have even 10 grand around to buy a car, right? So I don't want to come across as like living in a bubble and not thinking about who really drives the auto market and how important it is for our economy. So we're going to, again, we might have scrappage schemes. It's been talked about. Schumer talked about it, but you're going to see other policymakers at the state and the federal level start talking about how can we create some kind of substitution or a bit of some currency for that devalued car to get more and more, not everybody all at once, but more and more price-sensitive families into those new vehicles. We're going to have to innovate.
So Jeremy has a question. It says, if utilities can't keep up with EV demands, it takes about 7 years to build a new plant. How do we keep up with the pace of that? So I guess the question really is what are you seeing the utilities discussion going on around?
Yeah. So of course, they're moving the car sales to 30% of sales in 10 years, but then to move the fleet, Senator, it might take an extra 10 years, right? So for every one car, car has a useful life of 17 years, thereabouts. By the mid-2030s, we still have less than 10% of cars on the road in the United States, EV, right? So it's a lot more gradual when you look at the miles traveled. But in some communities where they might move very rapidly into EVs, you're going to have problems. You might have blackouts. You might need some upgrades. So my point is, you have to plan now. It won't hit the country all at once, but there'll be certain parts of the country where it breaks down and have to plan ahead there. It's a question of software. It's a question of hardware, not just at the plant level for capacity. Our utility guys say it's not so much that we need more capacity to produce electricity, but we need to handle the electricity moving in and out of the grid and the distribution. In some cases, our electric grid is like, it's a joke how old it is. It's like 50, 60, 80. I mean, way past its sell-by date. It's the stuff downstream that doesn't take 15 years to build, but just takes a hell of a lot of money and some planning to replace, but can be done faster, if that makes sense. But by the time we're having this strain on the grid, the hope is that we've reduced the cost of batteries so much and have made so much more progress on wind and solar that the switching costs, right, are less traumatic and can be done in a way where it's not like, shoot, we need to get this done in 2 years, because the storage can take the load off the grid. Is that if that makes sense? Again, it might seem as pie in the sky now, and look, we're going to create all sorts of problems and ESG problems along the way before we get there, but 15 years and a lot of other innovation in adjacent industries we think can help alleviate that.
So Angel has a question. Is it safe to say the industry and research has now a finite outlook on the EV technology versus other sources of fuel? So fuel cells, LNG, let's say,
hydrogen.
Those types of things.
If by finite you mean are we all throwing that out and saying it's pure EV? For the short and medium term, EV is where the action is, right? Hydrogen is still plugging along though. But even if you talk to hydrogen companies, when we talk to hydrogen management teams, even they say that you'll see hydrogen used in high utilization, vocational, regular occurring routes. You're not going to see it trickle down to light vehicles and personal vehicles anytime soon because of the chicken and egg of the infrastructure, right? This whole dedicated parallel infrastructure. And I know there's some oil and gas companies that talk about how things that move natural gas around can be repurposed to move hydrogen. That's true. But I think you're going to have multiple races. You're going to have the EV inflection happen right now. And our team thinks that maybe deeper into the 2030s, 2040, hydrogen that'll be the long-term future. In fact, we might even look there. I talked to some investors that say that EVs run the risk of being diesel, yet they're so bad for the environment and the rare earths and the chemicals and the things the mining operations are so intense that when you can really get renewably sourced hydrogen, right? That where you're not relying on some, rare, lithium in some mine somewhere, but could really create it anywhere in the world, theoretically, right? That's the future. But I guess the industry right now, so we know we have not written off hydrogen, but you have to recognize what's hot right now, and you're going to see this kind of, I don't want to call it an uncomfortable coexistence, but just, stay tuned, hydrogen, your day will come, but the car that Apple is developing is not a hydrogen car. The car that Amazon is developing is not a hydrogen car right now. One day, but not now.
So let's jump into the question of autonomy, electrification, and trucking. Because obviously there's a lot of discussions, whether it be Too Simple or Tesla or some other groups that are out there kind of in this, some that are really focused on autonomy, some that are focused on electrification. Walk us through the evolution of long-haul trucking over the next few years.
So, long-haul trucking, and we have an internal debate at Morgan Stanley about this. From an autonomy perspective, there's a lot of things about trucking that are easier. Fewer pedestrians, straight roads, tons of open space to measure, things. The driving a truck is theoretically more boring than navigating a small city car in the streets of whatever, Tallahassee or whatever. I'm not sure there are already small cars in Tallahassee, but anyway, you get my point. Madrid. But then the issue with trucking is when things do go wrong, and they will go wrong, it's a catastrophe. You're spilling toxic chemicals all over the place and creating this autonomous pileup that's like equivalent to an airline crashing. Right? I'm exaggerating a bit just to make the point. Whereas in city driving, the algorithm is much more complex, but the speeds are lower, and you can work with a lot more infrastructure and car to car, and so they both have their advantages and disadvantages. You're going to see both being used, basically. You'll see trucking used on long stretches of boring ass Highway 10 between whatever Phoenix and Tucson, right? That'll become like an autonomous just boom, straight line through the desert, and then there's parts of Florida where it's relatively boring. And that algorithm will learn. And then you'll see things trained in like double black diamond, San Francisco, hills, fog, chaos, people walking around naked, whatever's going on in San Francisco. It's all happening. And then I think that the state of the art of developing autonomous in truck will help the city driving, and the state of the art of training the neural network in the city driving will help the truck. So they both have their place. So I don't want to leave you an impression as this one's going to work and this one isn't. It does seem that most of the examples of companies like Waymo at Google that's operating right now, they've gone after streets. They've gone after city driving a little more. But there's definitely an eye on trucking as well. In terms of electrification, the problem with trucking is the battery and just the uptime, right? And just the charging infrastructure there too. But that's another reason why 2021 is a big year. Tesla's going to unveil the Semi, and they say they're going to start delivering the semi truck at the end of 2021. I think it's going to take a little longer in trucking. I do. I think autonomy can move quickly in trucking for certain areas, but electrification, I think it's going to take a while. Due to the energy density and the uptime.
So we've got a bunch of state and local policy leaders on this call. What would be your guidance to them as they're kind of trying to plan for the road ahead?
Well, I just think you want to make sure, careful where you get your information from. You need to talk to everybody. I talk to political leaders that just say, I got a great relationship with XYZ Legacy Detroit Auto Company. And I'm like, careful, because that would be, to a degree, like planning for electric grid rollout by talking to the whale oil consortium. I'm being a little unfair because I do think that there is more of repurposing opportunity for the legacy OEMs. So you need to talk to everybody. You need to talk to Apple, who has a finger in the transportation pie. Certainly Amazon, the legacy guys, Elon. But the world doesn't begin and end with Elon, but you have to include him in the conversation. But I think if I were to pick one thing, and there's so many different ways we could take that, I could answer that question. I think the hottest area you're going to see, I have a hunch you might agree with me on this, is the essential services of logistics fleets. I think if you sit down with the companies that are in the business of getting stuff to your front door during COVID and even before and after COVID, they have the resources to sit down with local regulatory bodies, with the utility commission, to figure out where to put the infrastructure and to pretty much all but guarantee the utilization. See, if you're trying to wait for people to get rich and buy a Tesla, you could open up infrastructure that could just be empty forever or for a very long time. But if you're sitting down with Uber or Lyft or Amazon or whatever logistics network, they have the data to say, no, this is if and when we move to EVs, this is where we're going to need charging, and we'll help build it with you. And so I think will that change the world overnight? No, but what it does is if you work with the commercial side first, you get some nodes of density, you get proof of concept, you're going to learn a lot. You have a big commercial partner too that can also help shoulder the bill, so it's not just your taxpayers, right? Let's be honest. And then as that matures, then it'll lower that hurdle for the families and the consumer aspect of it. It's really not unlike what the rollout of the electric grid. Again, I'm sorry if I keep going back to that, but the early electric grids weren't for homes. They were for businesses. They were for smelting operations that were next to hydroelectric dams, right? And they were for streetcar operators in Scranton. And then as they built out the electric grid for the streetcars and the small businesses that replaced the wood burning and steam power, then the neighborhood could get electrified, right? And so I think if you start with the commercial and fleet, it'll trickle down, I think, in a lot more orderly way than if you just went after how do we get this particular zip code's neighborhoods turned on to electric. Does that make sense?
So we're in the middle of COVID. How do you think COVID has changed delivery? How has it accelerated delivery and people's thinking about delivered products?
I just think it's taken it from delivery as a convenience to I can't live without it. Really, like an essential service. I'd say it's by some impossible measure taken delivery to the realm of a utility. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to go back to electricity. Electricity used to be for rich people. J.P. Morgan had electricity in his house. Normal people had candles and gas and camphor and stuff, right? Then it became, I can't live without it. Horseless carriages were for rich people in 1905. Then Henry Ford's like, not anymore. And so I think with this story as well, delivery is, I've become so dependent upon it now. If you took it away from me, I've changed so many other parts of my life, how my kids get to school, where I am, how I work, whatever. We can't go back. And so to the extent that it's become more of a utility, Senator, I think that puts it more in the realm of, all right, cool. You're now you can be part of the solution. You are a utility that relies very heavily, that produces carbon, that fills our streets, uses my state's infrastructure, damn it. If you're going to play, you're going to pay. Let's work together, and not just the stick. Let's use the carrot too. And by doing so, and you work with the state of Florida and people that know what they're doing, you're going to find the cost of doing business and your ability to kind of keep pushing your utility forward is going to work a lot better here than in other areas.
So a few years back, we talked about the world being kind of shared electric and automated. There was a lot of discussion about will people own cars of the future, or will it just be some shared vehicle that shows up and you get on an app and you're paying by the mile, and this whole kind of shift. Has your thinking shifted on that to personal ownership still going to be around a lot longer? And we're going to have to, the transition is going to take longer to get to that future?
Yeah, I mean, even before COVID, Senator, that was looking like this is going to take a while longer, right? The behavioral aspect of it and giving up that personal ownership, it's a big, big step. After COVID, I think even more so in a way, because people really crave that personal transport. They're kind of fewer, people thinking twice before getting on a bus or something like that. Again, that'll normalize. But I think, and there's some conflicting issues here where I think, yes, because of COVID especially, personal ownership is going to be around longer. Maybe people avoid cities. That will also feed in more personal ownership, right? Versus the dense public transport networks. But I would still say you go way out when you have transportation that's really fully automated, connected, overwhelmingly run by fleets, due to safety and regulatory and cyber reasons, kind of has to be centrally controlled, that only a very few very wealthy households will justify owning their own car. So it's not that they will consciously want to give up freedom. They'll just say, the thought of owning a car is just not economical. And the alternative is just so much better. You'll look back at Uber from 2019 and say, that was so archaic. Then Uber now, working with Tesla or whatever, has a very hygienic, very consistent, homogeneous state of transportation. It's reliable, it's in seconds, it works, it's safe, there's cameras, I don't have to worry about the safety issues as much. And so you have to allow that to change. So I'm still going to cling to the personal ownership in the year 2040. It'll be here, it'll be exquisite. It'll be exquisite.
Well, I know we're coming up on the end. I want to kind of give you the last word of kind of anything else you think we need to really understand or know about as you're talking to, leaders across the industry, right? So both in the government side and in the private side, who are kind of trying to navigate the road ahead. Well, what's your kind of last words to them?
Well, my guess is my last words is come to Florida. I'm not talking my own book here. I swear I don't own property in Florida. I do have relatives in Florida, but that's the crucible, right? So many good things are happening in Florida. There's so much growth, and that brings with it growing pains, right? And challenges, real challenges, right? And so you're kind of representing the future. I think that there are things going on in your state that will move a lot faster than other parts of the country. So I'd say look at markets like Florida. Look at markets like Norway. If you really want to understand the future, look at Norway. This might be the only presentation you ever hear Norway and Florida used in the same sentence, but here I go. Why not? The EV penetration in Norway is 60%. I'm not exaggerating when I say that it's 20 years ahead of the world. So you want to hear about charging infrastructure problems and grids being shut down and how poorer households dealt with it, what happened to gasoline taxes and things and all. That's a time capsule, a future capsule, I should say, of what you're going to experience. I'd look at those kinds of things. I would also look at examples in China of what they're doing there, because they have national policies that are getting hyper aggressive, and it means that they're going to experience problems before you do, right? And so you can learn from them. And then just talk to everybody, and just keep trying to make your companies or your states or your congressional districts or your constituency, try to make it as fertile a ground for innovation as possible, right? Really bet on the people in your constituency. There's nothing better. The best things happen when you have the human brain and capital and just a little sense of, I'll say urgency. I don't want to say fear. A little sense of urgency. And when that's when the magic happens. And so I'm optimistic, as I said in my prepared remarks, that this story of future and autonomous vehicles can be one where we really unlock some very, very exciting chapters in our country's future. So.
Perfect. Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us. Incredible conversation, incredible topic. Always appreciate your perspective on these issues. It brings such a wealth of knowledge to all the people that have joined us today on the FAV, and for everybody who's on, we hope you'll stick around. And January 21st is our next automated vehicles discussion. We're going to have some great industry leaders we'll be announcing here in the next couple weeks. But really excited about the future of this conference as we get into early next year. So again, Adam, thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in the future at FAV.
Take care, everybody. Be safe. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.